Hi, my name's Dave Adams, and you are watching The Core Mechanic, and today we are looking at number 83 on Mike Selinger's list of 100 games you absolutely, positively must know how to play, Stratego. Stratego is a two-player combative head-to-head war game, much in the same theme of chess with some significant differences. Stratego is played on a 10 by 10 square board with each player holding 40 pieces in their army. Each army is comprised of a flag, several bombs, a spy, and then ranks from Scout through to Marshal. Each rank is provided a value, such as Marshal has a value of 10, and through down to the Scouts, which have a value of 2, the Spy, which has a value of 1, and the Bombs, which don't have a rank or a value, and the Flag, which is of course also neutral in that sense. The object of the game is to outmaneuver your opponent's military forces, to conquer their military forces, to outplay their military forces, but ultimately to capture their flag. Each rank can only be taken by another rank that has a higher value than it. So for instance, lieutenants can be taken by captains, captains can be taken by majors, and so forth up the chain through to the marshal, which is the highest rank. But the ranks are also dependent on the number of characters they have on the board. So there's only one marshal, but there's also only one piece that can beat the marshal, and that's the spy, and she's ranked number 1. So while there's only one marshal, there's also only one piece that can take the marshal, and she can be taken by literally any other piece on the board.
First Division, charge!
General! Major!
Now, outranked.
Stratego was first trademarked in 1942 in the Netherlands by Jacques Johann Mergendorf and is believed to be a recreation of the game L'Attaque, a much earlier French game that focused around the wars between Napoleon and England. But some suggest that this may be in itself a rendition of an earlier game, a Chinese game called Animal Chess, or sometimes called the Animal Game. It was played on a smaller board, but in much the same way, with even lakes that were impassable by the pieces. However, Michael Ziegler contests the Jungle Game origins, referring mostly to the work of Stuart Cullen, who did some extensive research into old styles of games done within different tribal groups, and that he states that the Jungle Game was not a part of that research, mostly because he did his research in the 1900s, and the Jungle Chess game is a 20th century invention. However, unfortunately, I've not been able to gain access to any of the research on that, and so I haven't been able to prove or demonstrate if either case is particularly true. Now, in terms of gameplay, a number of weeks ago, I released a video where I talked about war-like games, or these sorts of strategy games being more akin to trick-taking, where games like Magic the Gathering or other forms of CCGs or LCGs use trick-taking as an essential way of determining which character or monster or creature or whatever has the final outcome. This is a very simplistic form or illustration of that point. Stratego is essentially a trick-taking game where you are trying to play your higher piece over your opponent's lower pieces. If you need some illustration of that, look at the game Dire Monsters, where Dire Monsters has only 5 cards, each ranked from 5 to 1, where the higher rank wins, except for rank 5, where the 1 wins. And so what you get is this probably more elaborate form of scissors, paper, rock. But what's interesting about Stratego is the number of pieces you have. There's 40 pieces on the board. That makes for a really congested board with 2 lake zones, which means that no piece can pass over those lake areas, creating bottlenecks and really constricted battle zones. You will be forced to go into battle with your opponent, but you will be forced to try and find ways to break through their ranks, to test their defenses, to try and find ways to get through their defenses so that you can ultimately hunt down their flag. You'll be allocated a higher number of lower ranked characters, which means for some parts of the game, you're essentially throwing pieces into the fore in the hopes of achieving some sort of bit of information. And information is the key word for this game. Unlike chess, this isn't an open information game. There isn't access to all the information of where the pieces are. Some of the genius behind Stratego is the fact that, firstly, your opponent doesn't know where you've placed your pieces. You get to choose where your pieces go. There's no set starting game design, unlike chess where you have all your pawns in the front row, and then in the very back row you have all of your higher ranked or stronger pieces with their different abilities. Gosh, that's a really bad way to describe chess. The fact that your opponent can't tell which piece is which, they can see where your pieces are, but they don't know which ranked pieces are in the front line, are in the back lines. They don't know where your flag is, they can't tell where the bombs are, and it is, as in a sense, you're testing the opponent's lines in a way to try and gain information. You're literally trying to do reconnaissance, and sometimes that means sacrificing a piece. What essentially this game is doing is creating a fog of war. Now, if you've ever played a computer game like Age of Empires or StarCraft, where you're building civilizations, trying to build troops and all that sort of thing, you have what's called the fog of war. On the map, you can only really see where your pieces are, and you actually have to send pieces out to explore the map to know what the terrain is like, what your opponent's up to, and it becomes a big part of the strategy of the game. This is one of the few games, and probably one of the earliest games, that utilized that fog of war concept and used it in a board game fashion. That ability to see what's going on without really knowing entirely what's going on. The fog of war in this game is a significant part of defense as well as offense. It gives you the ability to create strategies of creating some sort of instance going on one side of the board and giving your opponent the feeling that you're building some sort of offensive there, and your opponent has to test your defenses and try and gather as much information as they can based on battles and outcomes to try and determine what strategy you're actually trying to employ. Now, while the battle mechanics are much easier than chess and the piece movement is much simpler than chess, it shouldn't be considered a game that is easier than chess. Yes, in some sense you can play a completely random game, have a potential of winning. Theoretically, that can happen in chess too, but there is a great deal of strategy that goes into a good game of Stratego. Often Stratego gets this image of being a kid's game, of being a highly random game. But that unknown element is part of the tactical advantage as well as the significant disadvantage, and it's one of those really challenging, complex issues to overcome in the game. And it's not really about being random, it's about trying to find ways to effectively overcome that hurdle. The fog of war element is really well done in this game, and technology has only helped it to get better. More recently, with the many innovations of the game, there has been an electronic version of the game where you don't actually have to let your opponent know what your piece is. You simply place your piece in front of the other piece and hit the button to declare an attack, and the computer determines which is ranked higher and only tells you if either it's a draw or if which piece has won, which limits that information down even further. For this game to be effective, you must be willing to engage in a deductive process, this process of elimination, working out what the pieces are doing, what your opponent's doing, in the meanwhile trying to enact your own strategy. Trying to get this balance, keeping this tension, can really make for some very exciting and interesting games. So the big question is, as a game designer, what could I learn from the game of Stratego? Now, Stratego really elaborates on a pretty common theme of war, and it uses some very simple elements which people were familiar with, and perhaps picks up on some more ancient games, which is part of the debate of the historical elements of the game for sure. But at the same time, I don't think it's deniable that the game does pick up on elements of chess and perhaps elements of other games that were known at the time to create this sort of balanced tension, one versus one competitive war-like simulator. But for me, as much as I'd like to look at the fog of war and say, how can I invest that into a game? And I have many times thought about how fog of war could be used in board games, never quite so successfully as in Stratego. For me, it's the small changes to the game that really adds to what they've done with Stratego. And what I mean by that is they've taken the simple chessboard. It's not quite the same size, but at the same time, what they've done is they've added to it these 2 lake areas. And that seems like such a nothing thing to do. You've got X number of squares that no piece can go over. And yet that suddenly changes the scope of battle. Those lakes add in some problems if you're trying to attack your opponent. They add in some defensive capabilities if you're trying to defend against your opponent. The lake actually changes the battlefield and creates a whole new dynamic to the game. You can't just rush forward with all your troops. It's not that old style of military battle that you see in movies like The Patriot, where everyone just lines up in front of each other and then just rushes in. This now requires you to navigate your way around. You create bottlenecks. You have to deal with the fact that if you send in troops, they're going to be attacked, or there's going to be a defensive fortification there that you have to overcome. What are my actual resources? How can I best utilize my resources? What is the potential threat of the enemy, and how can I use my resources to the best of their ability to overcome any possible threat that could come my way? These sorts of decisions are really interesting, and it's such a simple little addition. 2 little lakes, a few squares that neither player can use. Suddenly the game is completely different. I think it's those little elements that are added to games which add that complexity or that depth, but it's so simple. It's just so clever to think, I wonder if this one little thing could make such a big difference. And that's the sort of thing I want to think about. I like to take away from this game. Yes, the Fog of War is amazing. It's really well done. But just that simple thing of, well, what small thing could make a big difference in this game design? At the same time, the lakes are not too much. They're not something that could be trimmed away from the game and still retain the same game. It would be a different game. And for me as a designer, that's that challenge of thinking, well, if I take it away, would it essentially still be the same game? Well, then let's get rid of it. What's the point of being there? But if there's that one little thing that can completely change up the game to make it just that little bit more interesting, that little bit harder, add that little element of complexity, then maybe that's the sort of thing I should include. It's just those little additions which make such a big difference that I really appreciate. Stratego in itself is a wonderful, fun little game. It's not highly complex like some of these other games. It doesn't have as much investment as chess, but at the same time, there's a lot to do. There's a lot of thinking that goes involved, and I think it's a really great game to play. But look, that's all we've got time for today, so thanks for watching. If you like what we're doing here, please hit that like button. If you're new to this community, please hit that subscribe button. We'd love to have you as a part of our community. And if you want to get updates on what we're doing, please make sure you click on the bell next to the subscribe button. Until next time, my name is Dave Adams. You've been watching The Core Mechanic. Bye for now.